Episode 1, Thanksgiving Dinner.
Holidays are coming up. Someone's going to have a few too many drinks, and it might be you. Maybe your aunt or uncle has been watching cable news all year just waiting to start a new fight or revisit an old one. If you're lucky, you might get out of this without getting trapped in the excruciating purgatory of discussing the election, but you probably won't be able to avoid the talk about guns. On today's episode, we cover how to handle those awkward conversations about gun control around the dinner table. I'm John Houtman.
And I'm Sarah Cade, and we're your hosts for Guns Guide to Liberals, the podcast where we discuss practical advice for reducing toxic partisanship, building rapport across the aisle, and making more persuasive arguments that help advance the 2A movement, one conversation at a time.
This podcast is for you if you want to be exposed to fresh ideas and nuanced pro-gun arguments, you want to have better conversations with people who disagree with you, you need to coexist with liberals or conservatives in situations where guns may come up in conversation, or you just want to be a more effective advocate for the Second Amendment movement.
Yeah, and I think the concepts and the tactics we're talking about here are applicable to a lot of different contexts, but we happen to like guns. We care about the Second Amendment, and we want to focus our energy on helping people talk about it better. We want to be able to talk about it in a way that brings people in, makes people understand what we think is so important about it, and can maybe share that value with the wider culture.
Yeah, and we want to talk about this in a way that causes people to come back for more conversations.
Yep, exactly. John, tell me a little bit about you.
I grew up pretty liberal in a big city in Philadelphia, and over the years, I kind of arrived at a more independent or libertarian point of view after all of this, largely due to getting involved in guns and the perspective change that comes with that and the kind of weird alienation that occurs when you step out of the bounds of what people define as being a liberal and become passionate about firearms in this country.
Right, and I experienced kind of a similar evolution. A friend of mine once called me a shall not be infringed liberal, which I think is accurate and also hilarious. But I went from kind of like a gun agnostic to a pro-gun advocate, and I guess you could call me a Second Amendment absolutist. I'll get into a little bit more about how that came about in the next episode, but just know that it's possible, I guess.
Yeah.
That's what I'd like people to know.
In this podcast, we're going to do our best to bestow the benefit of our experience, having come from these backgrounds and having had, a decade apiece of making the case for the Second Amendment to conventionally liberal people. From that perspective, we've identified a number of ways in which liberals and conservatives talk past each other and fail to communicate on the basis of values.
Yep, and that's really what we want to emphasize as we go along here. We're doing this in kind of a systematic approach, so each episode's going to have a little different focus. And for now, we're just going to talk a little bit about the main topic. We'll just jump right into it.
Timely, because the holidays are coming up and everyone's going to be saturated in each other's families.
Right.
So imagine you're sitting around the dinner table and you're Aunt Karen, who gets all of her information from Facebook memes, says these mass shootings are just horrible. All of these selfish gun owners who keep obstructing common sense gun reform have blood on their hands, and we, gosh darn it, have to do something. And then the room gets quiet, and everyone looks at you, the gun owner.
We're going to break down how to evaluate your options, how to proactively lead the conversation, the importance of modeling good behavior, and how to set boundaries to prevent bad behavior. First thing we're going to address, though, is it worth it? So are these conversations worth it? Why do we even do this? Why do we care?
Right, and are they mandatory? It's not like you're not going to get a plate of turkey if you don't have this fight with your aunt.
Yeah.
Right? You're not the opening match on tonight's ticket of arguments.
Mm-hmm.
It's not like if you don't fight, you don't get paid, right?
Right.
You're under no obligation to do this. So if someone's just itching for a fight, or if they're in it to belittle you intellectually or emotionally, or if they're not willing to do things like extend to you the benefit of the doubt that you've thought about this, you don't have to engage. However, if you encounter these interactions as though they're an opportunity to demonstrate that it's possible to have a sane interaction about this, and keep in mind that winning isn't proving them wrong in that moment. Winning is them coming back to talk to you about this again. then it might be worth it. And the more of those conversations that we can have overall with each other, the more incremental progress we make towards understanding.
I think there's a lot of factors to consider in these conversations, including your family dynamic. Like you said, these conversations aren't mandatory. It's important to think about, what do you get out of it? What's the cost? What's the benefit? So a couple costs that are factors to keep in mind. One, social stigma. So if you come out of the closet as the gun person and your whole family thinks that you are a heartless murderer of school children, you're going to have some social stigma to deal with. And it's nothing that you won't potentially be able to handle, especially with some of the skills that we're going to work on throughout this series. But it's something that's going to cost you energy. It's going to cost you time. It's going to cost you stress. And there's potential there for family tension as well. Is it worth it? Maybe. Maybe it is. It's really dependent. But you wouldn't be here listening if you didn't think there was at least a chance.
Right. Or maybe there has to be a better way.
Right.
Now, one of the things that's important to keep in mind is to set the playing field for the kinds of conversations that you're going to have. You can control the terms on which you have these interactions. Now, it's entirely possible that someone who's itching for this kind of fight is going to have their arsenal of talking points ready to go, and that they imagine that you are a mascot or effigy for which all of these talking points are made. You can up front ask for certain things. Ask them if they're serious about this kind of conversation.
Ask if they're willing to remain calm and discuss it politely. And if that ground rule is something that they can't follow, just don't engage. It's not worth it.
Yeah. You can also ask them if they're willing to take you personally and seriously, and that you're not just a avatar of someone who disagrees with them. Mm-hmm. Ask them to keep in mind that you are their family member and that you've thought about this.
You're a real person. I'm a real boy. You've thought through your opinion just as they have, possibly more. But if they can come to the table with at least some baseline respect, there's a chance you could get a really successful interaction out of this. What are some benefits then of having these conversations? If the goal of these conversations is not to change their mind in the moment, then what do you really get out of it? And the answer there is you're going to build better understanding of each other's values. If you handle these conversations well, you're going to improve your relationships. You're going to improve your conversations just in general, your conversational skills. And it's going to strengthen your family bonds and your family ties, because now you've created a space where you can discuss anything, even controversial things, and know that everybody still loves each other and respects each other. And I kind of feel like that's something that we haven't lost it entirely, but it's kind of going out of fashion in today's political climate.
It's difficult, and everyone's always kind of itching for that fight.
Right.
Because there is some self-assertion involved in that. Every time you have that kind of fight and you encounter someone who's willing to fight back on the same kind of crummy terms, you do get a form of confirmation bias. When you go into a dumb argument with dumb talking points, all you're really going to get in a lot of cases are kind of simple and dumb rebuttals back. And you go, look, that's all the stuff I'm familiar with. I was right about all those people.
Mm-hmm. And it really just builds up resentment, builds up bad feelings, and nothing gets accomplished. But that's an interesting point, too, that you brought up. So everybody comes to these discussions with some past experiences. And I know as a hardcore gun person, I've had so many of these conversations.
Oh, yeah. And 3 sentences in, you already know what they're going to say next.
Yep. And it's really hard to disrupt that and kind of break into it. But I mean, that's what we're going to work on.
And we can do that a couple ways. One is knowing that they are expecting a negative interaction, and they are expecting that negative interaction in order to confirm their existing opinions and feelings. What we can do is be deliberate about the kind of interaction that we want to have and steer it towards the positive.
Mm-hmm.
Now, why is that important? It's easy to get the list of every town talking points and just go through them one at a time and refute the facts and logic at hand. However, there's a distinction between knowledge and belief that comes into play here. So facts are important because facts inform knowledge, but emotions inform belief. And belief is the gatekeeper to knowledge. Belief determines whether or not new or different knowledge is necessary, and it also determines what kind of knowledge is desirable or applicable, right? So it's easy to, we hear Ben Shapiro demagogue the phrase, that facts don't care about your feelings. And to an extent, that's true. Facts exist, and the facts are the facts immaterial of your feelings, right? But your beliefs care about your feelings. And if you can put in some legwork to manage the feelings that are going on in that interaction, it's not going to turn into a fight, and you can do things like keep their beliefs susceptible to change instead of hammering on their emotional state and creating a context in which their emotions prevent their beliefs from changing.
Yeah, and that's one of the biggest things we fight in these arguments is we're not really fighting the values or the viewpoints, and sometimes not even the policies of the person we're discussing with. We're fighting that resistance. And it prevents new information from coming in. It prevents understanding. It prevents any kind of humanizing of the issue. And our goal is to kind of break that down with a couple of different strategies. But before we get to that, there's one more point I want to bring up here, and that is zealots. Every now and then, you will encounter someone who is absolutely, completely, firmly fixed in their position and is unswayable. In those cases, it's not really a discussion, because a discussion implies that there's a chance that one or the other of you can change or adapt or come to some sort of agreement. But if you come into that discussion presupposing that your mind is completely made up, you are a zealot. Now, in a way, on the pro-gun side, we can be zealots too, this definitely goes both ways.
I mean, we're doing zealotry now.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we are.
It's a soft zealotry.
It's soft zealotry.
But, if Aunt Karen shows up with all of her cats and all of her crystals, she's ready for a fight. And she's just trying to bait you into that argument. Right. And she's got, her handbook of Occupy Blue spiritual healing wellness memes that she's going to throw at you.
Right. And she thinks the same thing about you. Like, she thinks you're ready to light up that tiki torch and go on a white supremacist march.
Right. You're got to make America white again.
Right. It absolutely goes both ways. So the thing about zealots, if you are talking to someone and for a fact their opinion is not going to be swayed, there's really not a lot of point in that discussion, except for if there's spectator value. And that right there is one of the most important things we can do as Second Amendment advocates. Even if we're talking to somebody that we know can't be swayed, we just can consider, is anyone else watching this discussion? Whether it's around the Thanksgiving dinner table, whether it's on your Facebook page or anywhere else, is there any potential person that could be listening that's maybe on the fence and wants to see who's going to present a better argument? Maybe they haven't fully made up their mind and they want to consider each side. They want to hear what you have to say. They want to hear what Aunt Sally wants to say. They're on the fence, but they're amenable to new ideas.
Yeah.
So that's the person you're talking to.
And you never know who you're going to get a back pat from and say, oh, thank you so much for not getting into a fight with Uncle Bill. I know he's really crotchety, and I appreciate you not letting Thanksgiving get out of hand. And then 6 months later, that person messages you or sends you an email and is thinking about going to the gun range. And they've identified you as a safe path to that. That
exact thing has happened to me on a number of occasions.
Yeah.
Somebody said, oh, I noticed you were talking to so-and-so about this, and I just thought you kind of seem to know a little bit about guns, and maybe, you're a sane and reasonable person. Could you take me to the range? That has happened to me before. So the thing to remember about zealots, don't engage with a zealot. My friend calls this rule 3 of of the interaction. So I don't actually even know what rules number 1 and 2 are. They're probably don't talk about Fight Club, but
don't get off the boat and always bring a towel.
And right. But rule 3 is do not engage with zealots unless there's spectator value. You know your family best, so kind of make your own decisions there. I think it's just important to think about your motivations. If you're going to engage in these conversations, and I hope that you do, think of it in terms of the movement rather than your personal ego. It's not about winning. It's not about owning the libtards. It's about what are you doing to help the Second Amendment movement in the long run.
Yeah, remember, there is no win in that moment if you approach it in terms of proving them wrong. The win is in having a second conversation and then a third conversation and then being eventually someone that they come to when they have questions. Because right now they're getting all of their questions answered by the things that confirm their biases.
Yep.
They're going to all of the usual suspects to get their information. And if you can have 1, 2, 5 quality conversations with them, at some point they're going to start coming to you for information, at which point you're in a position to influence their beliefs. As a result of that, be in a position to correct the facts that contribute to their body of knowledge.
Yeah, and it's not about, like you said, it's not about proving them wrong in the moment. It's about opening the door for that future conversation and just kind of making an investment in the changes that we need in order to kind of create the conditions that help us be more persuasive in the future. If you decide not to engage with somebody, there is no shame in that. And if you say, you know what, I've got a little bit of a temper. I think if I try to talk to Aunt Sally about this, I'm just going to make it worse. Thank you. Thank you for your service. Quite honestly. Because this stuff is not for everybody, but everybody can get better at it. So maybe if you're not comfortable having a discussion about something that is really important to you as a core value, practice these skills on stuff that's not quite so important to you. Once you get good at it, revisit this subject later.
Yeah, if you can't scroll through a comment section without angrily replying to everything that bothers you, step 1 is to learn to relax, let it go. Don't make dragon resistance when we could otherwise be gradually influencing people's position on this.
Assuming you do want to have this conversation, how do you make it productive? So the key to that is to be proactive with it. The number one best thing you can do, and Sally says, those gun owners have blood on their hands and blood's running in the streets and we need gun control now. The first thing you can do is ask questions and clarify exactly what it is she's saying and exactly what she thinks about it. So the bonus here is you can stall for time if you're kind of, if like me, I'm a non-confrontational person. So when somebody really challenges my core beliefs like that, it gets my adrenaline up. And I need to take a minute and just listen and let my adrenaline settle down a little bit so I can start to think and come up with a good response. A great way to do that is to just ask, oh, why do you feel that way? Or, if you ask a why or a how question, that's a good way to have them talk a little bit more, give you a little time to settle down, and then also clarify their position. Make sure you're not going to respond to something they're not actually saying.
You've jumped into the frigid water, and you need a second to get over the shock of being that cold a little bit.
Right.
And also, in some cases, maybe they just want to blurt out what they're thinking, and they just want to vent their feelings. And after a couple questions of what's on your mind, let them just sort of get it out, and maybe that's the end of it. Maybe they don't really want to engage much further after that. What's an example of a question you would ask in that context?
Well,
so I say to you, man, I don't know how you sleep at night with everything that's happening. It would just make so much more sense if we did something about this.
I guess I would ask, is there something specific that's driving this? Like, what's keeping you up at night? And then let you kind of talk a little bit about, what it is. Like, oh, it's those mass shootings, or, oh, it's those school shootings, or it's the gang shootings, or whatever specific thing it is. If you can try to get them to be more specific and kind of lead them to a more specific place, then you can try to respond to what they're actually saying. But if they just want to rant about like, oh, guns are horrible, that's a little bit of a different conversation.
At a certain point, once you've asked enough whys or hows, or what would you do to change the circumstance? Why do you think this circumstance occurs? What are the root causes of the problem that you think you've identified? And what do you imagine solutions being for this? And at some point, since the talking points are going to run out, so are their ideas and their solutions pretty typically. They'll probably get annoyed as their well of information runs dry, and they might get a little agitated, but they also might kind of slow down and peter out. And there's a negotiating tactic where you don't rush to fill the silence. So if you've said what you have to say and there's a pause, you don't have to keep talking to fill the time. You don't have to continually throw fuel on the fire and give them more things to kind of clumsily try and rebut.
Yeah, and the other cool thing about that, too, is when you ask questions like, how does that work exactly? Your aunt says, well, we need background checks. Oh, well, how do you think that how specifically do you think that would address the problem that you're talking about? When people have to actually explain their position and explain in detail how it technically works and how the policy they're thinking about connects to the solution they want, it tends to moderate their opinion. So if you ask them to explain in detail how we get from point A to point B, by the time they get to point B, they're going to have moderated themselves without you even having to do anything at all.
Yeah, part of what you're doing by asking these questions is illustrating to them how low resolution their conception of the issue actually is. Because if they can only go 1, 2, or 3 steps away from the start in any direction, as it becomes obvious that there's more to this landscape than what they've mapped out for themselves here, they'll sort of start to realize that they're missing information and that the picture is bigger than the puzzle pieces they're holding in their hand.
Right. So you've introduced the idea of complexity. And so once you get that in people's brains a little bit, it becomes a lot easier to discuss these issues because a lot of people have kind of a misconception that it's a black and white issue. It's simple. It's common sense. We're going to get into common sense a little bit later.
Hate common sense.
Yeah, we all hate common sense. But the other strategy you can use in the moment is you start by asking your why and your how questions. And if you can focus those questions on their feelings rather than specific policies, that can be helpful as well. So like, what is it that makes you feel that way? Or how does that feel for you when you see this? You can kind of get them to kind of like look internally a little bit as well. That can kind of help. The other thing that helps there is if you can take the focus off of policy. To do that, you can get philosophical. And the goal with that, if you take the focus off of a particular policy on which you might never come to agreement, for example, it's going to be really, really difficult to convince me that background checks are worth a damn. We'll get to that also in later episodes. But if you can kind of look at the values behind it, take it back to a philosophical level. Forget about what they said in the actual moment, but think about the bigger picture and get down and ask more of a values or an ethics question. That gives you the opportunity to turn a fight into an actual enjoyable conversation. You can involve everybody at the table, and you can make it kind of a fun, like, getting to know you thing rather than a fight over a specific policy.
And the other thing when you get philosophical like that is that you're talking to the person at that point. You're not talking to the playbook of talking points.
Yep.
Right? If you can get them to put down the every town litany and prayer book for a second and have them talk about their values from the heart, then you're actually talking to that person. If I want the, Moms Demand Action talking points, I'll just go to their website. I'm not going to waste my time and throw a genuine human interaction down the toilet if I wanted to hear someone parrot talking points. And so if you ask them about their personal beliefs, they can't regurgitate those from anywhere. They have to come from themselves.
Yep, and the same for you, and they don't care about the NRA talking points. If you start saying NRA talking points in these conversations, you're going to lose people immediately because they're tired and they're stale. A lot of them are just not very sound, and they kind of miss that human connection as well.
Yeah, if it's on a bumper sticker, don't say it.
Yep, pretty much.
Just take everything that's t-shirt, bumper sticker, meme level, and throw it out.
Yep, just get rid of it. Some sample philosophical questions. So a good philosophical question does not have a right answer. So that gives you a little more of a chance to kind of debate the pros and cons. And it gives you an opportunity to allow people to be right about things. So one of the most important things you can do in these debates is to give people a chance to be right. Give them a chance to feel smart. Nobody wants to feel like, they're on the losing end of a debate. So if you can kind of throw people a bone whenever you can, even if you have to stretch, even if you have to really reach to find something that they're right about, it's absolutely worth doing. And these philosophical, open-ended questions give you a chance to really do that well. So a couple samples, and there's no real right answer to these. How do you decide what's reasonable in a society where people have different lived experiences?
Another thing you can ask is when they appeal to common sense or obviousness, you can ask them something like, how would you respond if I thought something was self-evident, but your knowledge and experience said it was complex and not obvious?
How do you balance the interests of the community versus the interests of individuals?
Can you imagine a circumstance where violence is justified? Is self-defense inherently ethical?
How do you balance the utility of something with the harm it might cause?
How do you balance freedom and safety?
Those are all just hypotheticals there. So you can ask whatever seems appropriate for your family and for your discussion. But the goal is just to keep it general and light. You want to avoid asking any leading questions. So I wouldn't say like, well, what do you think is more important, freedom or security? Because then that kind of like draws them into a trap where they think you're going to trick them into saying that security is impossible or, something like that.
And in these examples, we don't have to argue about each of these. It's entirely fine if they express an opinion that you disagree with. If they say, well, safety is clearly more important than freedom, say, well, that's really interesting. That's a point where we're going to have a conflict. And that's a point where a lot of people are going to have a conflict. But you don't necessarily need to convince them in that moment that freedom is more important than safety.
We're going to get into a little bit of what to do when you have a conflict like that in just a minute. But the other thing you can do when you're doing these philosophical questions is make it fun and involve everyone. Even involve, your family, involve your kids in age-appropriate ways. Make it a round table where everybody gets to have an opinion. Everybody's opinion is respected. And now it's become a fun and like bonding, strengthening family activity.
So at this point, we've had this whole conversation, and you might say, well, you haven't talked about the issue at all. You haven't talked about guns anywhere in this conversation with your conversation partner or adversary or however you want to frame it.
Partner.
And so we're not trying to obfuscate or deflect from the issue of guns. It's not that we can't argue the facts. It's not that we can't argue the policy. It's that that's not where the mind is going to be changed in this instant. And it's not that facts and policy don't matter. But what we're trying to do is create a positive experience and set the stage for a return to the gun conversation, at which time they will approach it knowing that you're a sane, rational, thoughtful person who can be trusted to have conversations in good faith. And the more this goes along, the more you're going to be able to address factual errors or the complexity of certain kinds of policy. And those come later, because if you put them up front, they're just a wall. It's a wall. And it's like the wall of shields that's going to clash in the battle.
Yeah, it's absolutely key to build that rapport before you do anything else. And one of the best ways to do that is to validate their feelings and values. No matter how wrong people are on the details, it doesn't matter. We're not talking about facts. We're not talking about details now. We're just talking about validation of their values and their feelings as a human being. And that's part of that basic respect. It's part of being a good listener. It's part of making people want to talk to you and want to have these conversations and see you as a trusted resource. Think of it as kind of an investment. Validation. So one way you can kind of work on this if you're not used to doing this already is to make yourself a little tape loop. So it's just a little phrase that you repeat. It's a little verbal thing that you can practice ahead of time. It gives you a little bit of an advantage in a situation where your adrenaline's up and you're having a tough conversation and you need something to kind of fall back on. Some samples for that.
You might ask a question, how do you balance freedom and safety? And you get an answer that would make you wonder how someone could possibly come to that conclusion, or, you find yourself like getting frustrated or what have you. But you extend to them the benefit of the doubt and understand that they're probably coming to that conclusion as a result of emotions or feelings about their beliefs. And you can just reply with something simple like, I think it makes a lot of sense to feel that way. My perspective is a little different, but I can see where you're coming from.
Or, I can understand why you'd feel that way. I'm curious about your feelings about ... Next topic.
Right. Just sort of like move them off of that.
Mm-hmm.
Or you can, validate again and say, that's really interesting. You bring up a broader philosophical point that would be fun to explore as a family. And in some cases, that kind of gets you off the hot seat if the conversation's getting painful.
Yeah.
Or
as they so often do.
And you can just kind of like share the misery. Or it's one of those things where if you have a relationship with them where they're not reserved or hesitant to offend or disrespect you, which might make the conversation difficult, you can kind of bring someone in who they don't have that kind of power dynamic with. If you're there with your uncle and your grandfather, and your uncle wants to push your buttons, but your uncle's still intimidated by his dad, you can bring him in the conversation. And you can kind of sneak that in by opening up, well, let's see what Grandpa has to say about that. And keep it from turning into something where they kind of, push your buttons and turn your dials.
Yeah, and the other thing you can do there, again, depends on your family dynamic, because your Aunt Sally might be the black sheep of the family, or you might be the black sheep of the family. So if you open it up to others, you zoom it out, you bring it back to a philosophical point, you can make it a kind of a more enjoyable discussion for everybody rather than you just being attacked. One of the next things you can do is model good behavior. So this is especially important if you have a leadership dynamic in your family. But even if you don't, when you set those conversational boundaries at the beginning, you can kind of take a little bit of a leadership role. To model good behavior, what you want to do is focus on the process and not the outcomes. It's kind of tough, but if you think of it this way, the conversation is the goal. The relationship building is the goal. Specific agreement on policy is not the goal.
Right. You're not there to close the sale. You're there to get the second meeting. At no point should you be going into this with the expectation that someone's going to say, my God, you're right. I've never thought about it like that. I'm going to just completely throw away everything I know, feel, and believe. Your goal is to have a productive conversation which improves your relationship and establishes trust. And then you win whether or not they agree with you. Part of what we need to focus on as advocates. So there is urgency. There are states whose legislatures hang in the balance. There are laws coming down the pipeline. There are things that feel very urgent right now, and they need to be contended with. This kind of thing is a parallel, long-term, effective strategy. Incrementalism has worked against us, and incrementalism works really well for every civil rights movement. And it's incremental until it's not, until you get to that tipping point. We're not here to win individual arguments. We're here to change the landscape that this argument is occurring on and sort of move people off of strident positions.
Yep, that's the goal. It's basically de-radicalization for politics, and that's something we desperately need right now. It's a slow thing. It's an investment. It's a long-term strategy. It's not the only strategy. And we're not saying like you should do this instead of whatever other things you're doing to advance the pro-Second Amendment movement. But this is something, it's an add-on. It's something I'd like to see spread, and I'd like to see more of us do it. You know, in some places we're doing well legislatively, some places we're doing well in the court system. But if you look at the overall culture war, we're not doing so great there.
Yeah, and it's not a good look for anyone. The culture war is like legions of stereotyped pawns trashing each other in the mud.
Right.
It's not good. It makes it hard to respect either side of any disagreement when you see how shabby the quality of the debate is getting.
That's kind of our goal with these conversations, is to rise above that. We're going to give people some different strategies to kind of change the game, change the narrative a little bit, give people a reason to listen to you when you tell them why you find the Second Amendment so important. When you're having these conversations, and especially if you're taking a leadership role, think of it in almost like a behavioral training standpoint where you're rewarding people for good behavior. So reward people with eye contact, verbal encouragement, call out any good points they make, expand on any good points they make, and especially the underdogs in your family. One thing to remember is if you've got 10 people around the dinner table and you've got Uncle Joe screaming at you, Cousin Shane in the corner, the underdog who nobody ever listens to, his vote counts just as much as Uncle Joe's. And if you acknowledge him and make him feel heard, make him feel appreciated, and, you know, bring him into this discussion, you have a chance of reaching him. And that's just as important.
Make them feel acknowledged, make them feel smart.
Yeah, nobody likes to feel like an idiot. It's painful. When you hear things that challenge your own bias, it's painful and it's unpleasant. It's just, it makes you not receptive to listening and learning. But if you can build people up, make people feel better about themselves, not only are they going to like you more, they're going to listen to you more.
Don't dunk on them.
Right.
Like they might set you up for it. They might like throw you a real slow, underhand pitch that you know you could crush into a grand slam in any other context. You might find that they've like contradicted themselves or come around to your point of view, or there's an opportunity for a gotcha. Just don't take it.
Yeah, be the bigger person. That's huge. Yeah, and especially for, I'm going to make a broad generalization here, and I know this is not always the case, but often the gun side of this debate comes to it with a lot more firsthand experience. They come to it with a lot more investment. For a lot of us, it's a really big part of our life and our identity, and it's something we do for fun on the weekends as well as something we advocate for in the legislature. A lot of us come to it with a lot more background than the average person that's going to just spout some anti-gun talking points. I do feel like it's on us to take a little more responsibility and do a little bit more work because we're the ones that care.
We're playing with a full deck in this conversation.
Right.
So we shouldn't stack it too hard.
Right. To clarify, we're the ones that care about the Second Amendment, not that we're the ones that care about society and, problems. So everybody cares about that, and we're going to presume good intent from everyone.
Yeah. Next.
All right. So the last part of our Thanksgiving dinner conversation here is just a little bit about boundaries, specifically boundaries for bad behavior. I'm sure you've experienced your share of conversations that just made you kind of feel sick in your stomach.
They can grind. They can be a real serious grind.
Yeah, they really can. So boundaries there. Just remember, you always have the right to call a timeout or to end the discussion entirely. That's okay. That's your right as a human being, and you can exercise that whenever you want.
You can just disappear into the bathroom for 45 minutes.
You really can. You can. You do not have to tolerate abuse. You are not obligated to do that. If somebody, either in their tone or in their words, is making you feel like dirt, you can calmly and politely call that out. So you could say, hey, John, when you say this, it really makes me feel like this. Like, when you say that gun owners are selfish, that makes me feel like you don't really know me that well because I'm not a selfish person. We're family members. We love each other. And when you say things like that, it really just makes me not want to talk to you.
Yeah. And in other cases, you can point out that they're arguing against a set of talking points that you haven't put forward, that they've fallen into the scripted argument, and that they are arguing with the invisible boogeyman in the room who represents all the things that are easy for them to argue against. And say, look, you can bring it back and say, look, we are having this conversation. It's not you and me and the ghost of the NRA in here.
Right.
It's not you, me, and Dana Lash.
Right. And one of our goals also with this podcast is to provide some better alternatives to the tired talking points that you hear so often. And one last thing for boundary setting, if you know you have a problem relative, one thing you can do is think about that and prepare yourself a tape loop in advance for the problems you're pretty sure you're going to encounter from that relative. Something like, I'm happy to discuss this with you calmly, Uncle Joe, but if you raise your voice at me again, I'm not going to participate in this discussion. It's good if you make it short, make it specific, make it kind of neutral as best you can, and then just repeat it as necessary. If you have to repeat it 10 times in a row, that's fine. You got to sometimes stand a little bit firm on these boundaries.
Now it's time for John's Bad Argument of the Day. Bad Argument of the Day is a recurring segment which will feature in every episode. Typically, it'll be an argument which both pro and anti-gun camps engage in, either in the form of the argument, like a fallacy, or an analogy which they'll both misuse or misunderstand.
So typically these arguments go nowhere. They're unconvincing and they're easily dismissed by the opposing party. And they just cause everyone to talk past each other. We're trying to get rid of these tired, stale arguments, and a lot of times the people employing them don't really have perspective on how flat they fall.
One thing that I'm going to try and do consistently is present the most charitable representations of arguments with which I disagree, to the best of my ability and understanding. There will occasionally be times that either brevity or ignorance get the best of me, so I'm asking for the benefit of the doubt ahead of time should I come up short and accidentally or negligently misrepresent an argument. Today's bad argument of the day is my favorite, least favorite, maybe, one of those. And it's the often misused analogy of guns to cars. I've heard this from both sides in some form or another. The gun control argument typically goes something like,
cars are responsible for about 35,000 deaths a year, the same as guns. And we take steps to license drivers, register vehicles, require insurance, institute safety inspections, and make a variety of safety technologies mandatory on automobiles. Everyone seems to agree that these actions are totally reasonable and don't infringe on anyone's rights. So why shouldn't we do all the same things for firearms?
The typical pro-gun rebuttal to this generally sounds something like, well, cars kill just as many people as guns, and I don't hear you calling for bans on cars or restrictions on certain types of vehicles. I don't think that requires a whole lot of depth in response in terms of illustrating what a bad argument that is. I think where that argument fails is it implies that the people who are arguing for gun control are doing so in bad faith, since they're willing to discount or dismiss the lethality of automotive technology, when I think that doesn't actually address the point. I think where the problem lies is largely in the original formulation. The only similarities between cars and guns is that they're both useful technologies employed and enjoyed by millions of people for sport, utility, entertainment, and personal empowerment. And they're both accompanied by substantial costs. In the case of this example, the combined deaths of about 70,000 Americans a year. But that's where the similarities, I think, kind of end. Because when it comes to those deaths, almost all of the automotive deaths are accidental. And almost all of the firearms deaths are intentional, with 2/3 of them being suicides.
Accidental gun deaths at about 1% of the total, while they are absolutely tragic and probably preventable in a lot of cases, they don't indicate a safety epidemic.
The thing is, with cars and guns, they are opposite and inverted problems. The issue comes into play when people try and represent all of the solutions implemented in the automotive space as applicable to the firearm space.
Right. So you're saying there are two different problems, two different solutions.
Right. The reason that we don't do all of those things with guns is because the problem is inherently different. It's not just a popular technology that happens to have a human cost attached to it, so therefore all the solutions are the same. Every safety strategy in the automotive space is implemented in order to reduce accidents and increase survivability in the event of an accident. And there are many variables which contribute to accidents. We're talking about vehicle condition, traffic condition, road condition and design, the weather, driver distractedness or alertness, driving speed, driving skill and experience, and so on. And all of the technologies and strategies implemented are to address issues like these. Not a single one of these technologies and strategies has any effect on whether or not someone chooses to deliberately crash their vehicle. And none of them are transferable to the issue of death by firearms. None of these solutions address intent. And addressing intent is crucial to reducing interpersonal violence and suicide.
So another thing to consider is we can design roads and intersections to reduce accidents by changing some of the environmental features. So maybe a better analogy between cars and guns is that improving the environments that generate the most violence could be like improving the intersections which generate the most accidents.
There are strategies in terms of road design and traffic analysis that reduce accidents, reduce speeding, reduce pedestrian deaths. And that environmental factor could be something that we, look into. Automotive solutions are generated by the investigation of root causes of fatal accidents, and it might be smart to have a useful and robust body of data on violence. I saw a article, actually just the other day, I think it's in that Discovery magazine, in which it mentioned that they identified some high crime and high violence neighborhoods and turned the vacant lots into parks, and the crime and the violence went down.
So did it just transfer to other neighborhoods, or did it actually go down?
No, it went down. It wasn't as though it was displaced to areas where that was not taking place. It just didn't occur.
That's really interesting.
It's a small snapshot, but we know that violent crime is highly correlated to social factors. Everyone has an intersection in their town where there's always like broken bits of headlight and mirror. Every town has one of those.
Well, thanks for listening to our first episode. As you can probably tell, we're new at this. I know, I'm a little nervous.
Yeah, but we make it look...
Right. I'm a little nervous. How are you doing?
Oh, no, I'm only sweating through the back of my shirt where you can't see.
Oh, yeah, no problem. This is a lot of fun for us to produce, and hopefully it's helpful for people to listen to as well. Thanks for bearing with us.
Yeah, stick with us. Each episode's going to get better.
Yep.
At least we look good and sound good.
Yeah, we're going to get there. We're going to get there.
Hopefully we're able to provide value off the bat. Stay tuned for the next episode. Oh, how can we sign off from this podcast without saying like, share, and subscribe? Please.
No, we're not saying that. People already know that. I refuse. I'm not saying it. Maybe we can end it with
Wu-Tang is for the children.